Once again, I, Ajay Jha, along with my ACS colleagues, Dr. Diksha Gupta, Dr. Kaushik Natarajan, and Dr. Mahesh Jha, welcome you to this special ACS Science Talk session in association with ACS meeting. Just to give you update around the upcoming ACS Science Talk, please visit our ACS in India webpage and register for the upcoming sessions. We have also uploaded the past lecture recordings on the ACS Science Talk virtual library. Feel free to visit, like, subscribe, and share among the scientific community. To keep you updated with the latest research findings, the product launches at ACS, we have a monthly newsletter, ACS Insights India. Subscribe today for free. We'll post the link into the chat box later. To begin with the scientific session, it's a pleasure and honor to have Professor Sarbajit Banerjee with us. Professor Banerjee is a Davidson Chair Professor of Science and a Chancellor EDGAS Fellow Professor at the Department of Chemistry, Texas A&M University. He joined the Texas A&M University in 2014 and is also an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Material Science and Engineering and the Texas A&M Engineering Institute. He earned his PhD in chemistry from State University of New York at Stony Brook in 2004 and then had a postdoctoral stint at Columbia University. He was initially a part of the University at Buffalo prior to coming to Texas A&M University, where he was appointed as the Davidson Professor of Science in 2017. His research interest includes spectroscopy and chemical imaging of the electronic structure of 2D materials, nanomaterials, solid-solid phase transitions, energy landscape in solids, electrocatalyst designs, and fundamental studies of the chemistry of energy storage, a glimpse of which he'll be sharing with us today. Professor Banerjee has a long list of awards and accolades to his credit. To mention a few, the Edith and Peter O'Donnell Award in Science, ACS Stanley C. Israel Regional Award for Advancing Diversity in the Chemical Sciences, National Science Foundation Special Creativity Extension Award, the Bilby Medal and Prize, the Rosenhan Medal and Prize, the Journal of Physical Chemistry Lectureship, the Minerals, Metals and Materials Society Young Leader Award, the Cottrell Scholar Award, the ACS ExxonMobil Solid State Chemistry Fellowship, National Science Foundation Career Award. He is currently the senior editor at the Journal of ACS Omega, and also serves on multiple editorial boards of prestigious journals. Before we invite Professor Banerjee, couple of instructions for the audience. We request the audience to post their questions into the Q&A tab. Please avoid putting questions into the chat box, and in case of any internet interruptions, please stay with us. Now, I would like to invite Professor Banerjee to deliver his talk. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Ajay. Share my screen. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good evening to most people joining from India. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to start by telling you about ACS Omega. It's no longer the new kid on the block, but it's really been a huge success, and it's ACS's big tent for featuring all different types of chemistry. So I encourage you to consider ACS Omega for your next article. We publish everything from original research articles to mini reviews, perspective, which are by invitation. You can contact the ACS team here if you're interested. And this is truly a global journal. Chemistry is central science. It is at the center of our way of life, and ACS Omega tries to capture that, tries to advance the idea of a global vision for chemistry. So thanks for keeping us in mind. We've recently completed our 5 years. The journal is going very strong. Follow us on Twitter. We also have a pretty large footprint on other social media channels. So look forward to connecting with you at ACS Omega. Okay, so with that, I'm going to jump right into my talk. If you have any questions about ACS Omega, we're also happy to answer them. Please feel free to put it in the Q&A tab. Okay, so before I start, I want to acknowledge my research group. That's the first group picture we were able to take last summer after COVID restrictions were lifted. We had to unfortunately go back for Omicron, and now we're coming out of it again. So the research I'm going to tell you about mostly was funded by the National Science Foundation and NASA and Vanitech. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who have helped with many elements of this work, particularly Baishang Shu's group at TU Darmstadt, Partha Mukherjee's group at Purdue, and David Prendergast's group at LBNL, amongst others. So, and as I go through the my talk, I'll highlight the contributions of several students. So, okay, let's start here. Why are we doing this? I'm going to talk mostly about batteries today, but it's important to start with a big perspective. So energy in this world is freedom, right? So having electricity, having a grid grants you a certain kind of freedom, freedom from darkness, freedom from cold, freedom from heat, and even freedom from boredom, right? So this is having access to power is really, really great, but it comes at a cost, right? So in about 83% of electricity generated in the US in 2018 is from non-renewable energy sources. So there's a huge carbon cost to this freedom that we are paying right now, right? And so what I'm going to tell you about is as we participate in this massive energy transition that is coming down the pipeline, there is a major role for energy storage, and I'll tell you about our efforts towards this. So given that, you know, if you don't do anything at all, and if you just proceed with business as usual, the IPCC predicts that there's going to be a 4°C rise in temperature, right? So that's really going to be devastating for the world. So really what we're seeing worldwide is a move towards green energy, slower than it needs to be. But this is happening. So the share of electricity production worldwide, coal is dropping, and renewables are starting to increase. Collectively, probably about 49–50% global energy generation, electricity generation by 2050 will be renewable sources, right? So this is a big transition that is underway. It is important to many aspects of our life, to the very structure of the electric grid, right? And so as we transition into this new phase, there's obviously lots of emphasis on solar energy. The average cost of solar panels has been dropping by almost 50% last 4 years. Existing solar panels now in the US have 12 million homes, still small, still lots of room to grow. Wind energy has also been massively growing. And India also has been one of the top 10 in the world for solar. So really big transition afoot in India as well. But the problem with solar and wind, of course, is that, well, you've got cloudy days, you've got still days when these are not available, right? So how do you make these energies more dispatchable? So what does that dispatchable mean? How do you make it so that when a power grid wants the energy, you have it ready to send, right? And this is a good chart, and it basically tells you the capacity factor, which is a factor that captures how often a plant is running, how often you can get energy out of it. So, you know, nuclear running almost all the time, whereas wind and solar are at the lower end of the spectrum. So they're really great energy sources in terms of being renewable, but they're not always available. So which means that as we transition our grid more and more to wind and solar, we're going to have to think very deeply about how we can store energy and dispatch it as needed, right? And this is a nice quote from this Atlantic article, right? The power grid is a titanic machine, and it has to be played like a Stradivarius, like a violin, right? At any moment, the power plants must generate about the same amount of electricity that customers demand. If you are out of balance, your grid can burst into flame or break down, right? So there's a very delicate balance that has to be maintained. And, you know, so how do we fit in wind and solar, especially given its intermittency, into this picture, right? So batteries are not the only form of storage. I would like to emphasize this. You know, there's also, of course, chemical storage like hydrogen that is also very important, or even ammonia production. Some people talk about it as a means of storage, but it is something that has that will be required. And there's, you know, batteries come in many different shapes and sizes. So lead acid batteries is something we've had for over 100 years now. And you've got these small format batteries, primary or rechargeable. And you've got lithium-ion batteries that power laptops and cell phones, and increasingly getting into electromobility as well as grid level applications. And then these large flow batteries, right, which are used for load leveling, grid storage applications. So depending on what you need, you're probably going to have a different type of battery. There's no one size fits all. You've got power, energy, capability, safety, portability, capacity, retention. All of these things are factors. And the global demand right now is driven extensively by electromobility, and then increasingly grid storage, load leveling applications. And it's worth keeping in mind, it's only been a 4-fold improvement in energy density in 160 years. So there's a lot to do. So lithium-ion batteries, 2019 Nobel Prize, really one of these chemistry discoveries, a chemistry story that has changed our world, right? If you look around you, if you in our landscapes, our lives, batteries are everywhere. Our cell phones we carry, our the music we listen to, the laptops, and it's because of work that was set foot by Goodenough, Yoshino, and Bittingham, and so essentially in practice, it's a pretty simple concept. You go thermodynamically uphill, and you store the energy, and then when you discharge it, okay, this is the thermodynamically favored reaction. This is showing cobalt oxide as a cathode. Lithium enters into cobalt oxide. You form lithium cobalt oxide, and that is you discharge the battery and you use the energy. You convert the chemical energy into electrical energy, and then again at night, charge your phone back again. You have the thermodynamically favored reaction. So I'm going to focus mostly today on the cathode. This is there's many different complexities to the entire structure of the battery, and for my talk today, I'm gonna be mostly focusing on the cathode. This is a picture of right before the Nobel Prize. It's I think a year before Dr. Bittingham got selected, and you'll also recognize Dr. Prashant Kamat, the editor-in-chief of ACS Energy Letters, and we it was really great to spend time with them. So I like this as I start thinking about batteries. This is a quote from Nature. After many years of suspended animation, the battery electric vehicle industry is really growing. And of course, electric vehicles compared with petrol vehicles make less noise and produce less atmospheric pollution, right? So this is really a great thing. Now, the one thing I left out here, but I'm showing you now, well, this was published in 1934. Okay, so while we are working on these important problems, they have been important for a while, and hopefully 100 years later, we're still not going to be calling it a problem. We're actually going to be, this is actually going to be solved, So that's the hope. So, but just to kind of emphasize, this problem's been around for a while. This is not new. We don't have good solutions for it, right? And one of the reasons we don't have a good solution is that this is really something that crosses across many scales. So starting at the level of atoms and electrons, to the level of particles, and then electrode architectures, and then macroscopic systems, right? And so I think there's a real central role for chemists here, because the consequences of atomistic and electronic structure are really very profound for function at the level of systems. And atomistic and electronic structure are necessary, but not sufficient. There's numerous mesoscale emergent phenomena that are often required as well, that are governed by geometry and topology. And part of this idea is it's really important to probe the dynamical evolution of materials as a battery functions, right? And then chemistry isn't in isolation. One of the most important and really interesting challenges in battery science has to do with how real-world applications intersect with earth abundance and supply chains and such. So how much of a particular material is available? Where is it available? All of these are really important, especially if we live in a changing world that looks very different from what it used to be even a couple of years ago. Okay, so if I distill this down, there's a few things we have to worry about in terms of familiar terms of thermodynamics and kinetics. So on the one hand, we need to have large delta G between intercalated and deintercalated phases, but not so large that the thermodynamically uphill process becomes blocked. We would like to have a relatively small lattice change upon insertion, because we don't want to have if there's very large changes going on, that will inevitably result in damage and mechanical stresses being built up. And ideally, for an intercalation cathode, you'd like to have interstitial sites where you can save, so sites where ions can come in and sit, and accessible redox centers. So the ions can come in and sit at a site where they can reduce or a certain transition metal, or so on and so forth, right? So thermodynamics is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to have kinetics. So there have to be low site-to-site diffusion barriers, relatively facile solvation, desolvation at interfaces, and intercalation reactions strongly favored over parasitic reactions, right? So this is a chemistry that has to work in 99.999 yield every cycle, right? Because if it doesn't, then you're going to very, very quickly lose capacity, okay? So most of my talk today, I'm going to talk about V2O5, vanadium pentoxide, as a model cathode material. It's got a high theoretical capacity, almost about 440 milliamp hour per gram. What's good about vanadium, like I said here, you have to have accessible redox centers that you reduce down. So you can take vanadium, and you've got 2 vanadiums per unit cell here. You can reduce each of them down, so to 4+, 3+, and so on and so forth. And the structure of V2O5, there's a lot of room to accommodate ions. So way back, Stan Whittingham and others thought this would be a great intercalation host, but quickly it turned out that there were quite a few problems to it. So the diffusion kinetics of ions is relatively slow. The electrical conductivity of V2O5 is not very good, and there's a whole series of irreversible structural transitions. So what I'm going to try to do is take you through a lot of work that has been done by my group and others over the years, over the last decade and a half, to bring these, to address these problems and develop a viable commercial cathode material. Okay, so let's start with looking at the problems. So one of the problems is that there's, as this is the structure of V2O5, so lots of room for ions to migrate, but the challenge is that for an ion to move from one side to the other, it has to go through an 8-coordinate site to a 3-coordinate site to an 8-coordinate site, right? So what happens, what this means is that there's a lot of bond breaking and new bond formation, and then bond breaking and bond formation that has to take place for an ion to move through the lattice. So very large changes in coordination environments. And the need to break a lot of bonds results in a relatively large barrier for lithium ions, and really very, very large barriers for other sorts of ions if you're trying to go beyond lithium ions. So that's one problem. The ionic diffusion barriers are very large. A second problem has to do with the structure, the crystal field splitting. You'll recognize the square pyramids that form part of the V2O5 structure, and that results in this very narrow conduction band that's dxy in origin, and this just comes from the crystal field splitting of vanadium 3D orbitals in a square pyramid coordination environment. And so because of this very narrow 3dxy band, the electrical conductivity is not very good. So there's a pretty large effective mass for the electrons. And this is work by Jesus Velazquez back almost more than a decade ago, where we used polarized X-ray absorption to really probe the bottom of the conduction band edge and establish that it's the vanadium 3dxy band that is involved in conduction. So moving forward a few years, this is work from Luis de Jesus and Justin Andrews in my group. We were able to do scanning transmission X-ray microscopy. So what we're doing here is we take a finely focused X-ray beam and we raster scan it across individual particles that are at varying extents of lithiation. And we can essentially acquire an X-ray absorption spectrum for one particle, or really on very, very small pixel sizes. So this is hyperspectral imaging. This is work done at the Canadian Light Source, really an incredible resource for advancing battery science and other kinds of science. And so what ends up happening here this is a experimental spectrum. Since this is acquired for one particle, one single crystal, it's very high resolution, spatially as well as spectrally. And we can see in here the transitions into different states, xy, xc, yz, x squared minus y squared, reflecting essentially the crystal field splitting of vanadium, right? And then you see the oxygen K edge as well. As lithium starts to come in and vanadium gets reduced, the 3D XY peaks get diminished in density, primarily because of Pauli blocking. So these states are occupied. Since they're occupied, they're no longer accessible for the spectroscopy. So they start to darken, right? So they don't no longer appear in the spectrum. And you see a pretty massive change in also the T2G to EG star ratio and at the oxygen K edge. So between these two, they serve as pretty good diagnostics, spectral diagnostics of how much lithium has entered into the system, right? So we're indirectly probing lithium by looking at the vanadium and oxygen and seeing how reduced they've become, right? And so this is a series of stick sim images collected before intercalation, after intercalation, and then after delithiation, after pulling the lithium out. And so without going through all of the details, there's a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to. So the DX5 band over here is strongly suppressed, and then the T2G EG star ratio strongly renormalized, right? So what that means is that there's a lot of lithium that's gotten into this. If I image this single or this group of wires, I actually see some pretty stark contrasts here, right? In terms of the T2G to EG star ratio, some pretty big. So this is the least lithiated. This is the most heavily lithiated here. And so even within the same particle, there's a lot of heterogeneity of lithiation, okay? So you've got parts of the particle that have more lithium, parts of the particle that have less lithium, right? And you can sort of see that all together in this sort of color map here. And we can be more quantitative as well when we use calibration standards, and you can sort of see this varying amounts of lithiation. And so that data is about 3 years old. This is data that's still unpublished. And if we do dichography, X-ray dichography, we can come up with an even higher resolution map looking at how lithium is dispersed in a single particle, or actually in this case, there's a couple of closely spaced particles. And again, you see some pretty strong gradients across the particle with not a lot of normalization. And this results, again, in lots of interesting motifs of lithiation. If your wire is particularly thin, you see very distinctive separation, charge striping, and pore shell motifs across individual particles, right? And so first question is, what is going on? Why is it that the lithiation is not homogeneous across the entire particle? Why do you see these these motifs? So diving down deep, and it comes down to this 3DXY, this narrow band that we have at the conduction band edge. So electrons occupy the conduction band edge, and essentially an electron situated on the lattice couples with the lattice to give you a small distortion of the lattice, and which constitutes a small polaron, right? So the lattice and the electron that's in it has stabilized and gives you a small polaron, and that small polaron can then trap lithium ions, and essentially you have a self-trapped polaron, right? So the combination of a localized electron and a lattice distortion is a polaron, and the polaron then traps a lithium ion yielding a self-trapped polaron. So this is really important, because as we search for higher voltage cathodes that have larger band gaps and so on and so forth, we're going to be more likely to stabilize polarons. And the polarons, this coupling of the electron with the lattice, can really inhibit lithium ion diffusion through the solid. Okay, so essentially what is going on, and this is a little movie I'll play for you. You can see as lithium ions come in, you've got a series of phase transformations that take place, and you go through these different plateaus, and the structure of the intercalation host also changes the lattice puckers to accommodate polarons. So there's, in other words, there's barriers to ionic diffusion, and then there's barriers to electron diffusion that has to do with coupling of the polaron with the electron with the lattice. And again, as proof of the polaron, you also see here very nicely these, remember, these dx5 states at the bottom of the conduction band edge go down, and these D to D transitions that are derived from localized electrons go up in the valence band. So this is some RIC spectra collected also at the Canadian Light Source. Okay, so and part of the consequences of this couple of these limitations, these polaron ion diffusion, there's a whole series of phase transformations that happen in the system. So lithium ions are coming in, and as they come in, there's a whole bunch of distortions that happen, and these distortions essentially will result in the lattice changing quite profoundly. Okay, and so you can see here with more and more ions coming in, initially the layers get pried apart a bit, the layers get puckered, and ultimately there's some pretty large changes that are irreversible. So it never goes back. So this is once it goes into this highly distorted gamma phase, right? So this is pretty important. So why is this a bad thing? Why is this important? So you can take the StickSim map that I showed you a couple of slides back. You can convert that into a composition map, and then that can be converted into a stress and strain map. This is work we've done with Baishang Shu's group at TU Darmstadt. And so even within a single particle, as a result of the heterogeneities that happen. So if you've got a large volume change happening as a result of lithium ions entering, it's not a problem as long as the particle homogeneously changes volume. But that's not what happens. Because of these heterogeneities, you end up generating quite a bit of anisotropic stress gradients and strain inside these individual particles, which ultimately will lead to fracture and breaking, these particles breaking off. And this mechanical degradation of the cathodes as a result of stresses built up because of these heterogeneities play a big role in why your cell phone battery starts to degrade after you've used it for a year or so, and so forth. These stresses build up and fatigue sets in, and these particles start to really break up in the cathode. And this is at the single particle level. Again, this is the composition map, and as a result of the inhomogeneous compositions, you see very inhomogeneous stress gradients inside the system. And I'll show you. This is single particle imaging of stress in one particle. Well, this is the whole cell measured using this MOS technique, multi-beam optical sensor, with my colleague Matt Farr's group. And you can see a big accumulation of stress for B2O5 particles. This is a single particle. You can see here, it was a little bit stressed before, but after a couple of cycles, it cracks, right? So this fracture in pre-strained particles as a result of cycling. So mechanical, the electrochemistry and mechanics coupling resulting from the stress gradients build up because of heterogeneous nucleation play a really big role in damaging cathodes, right? And this heterogeneity is not only across single particles, it's across networks of particles, and that has other very profound implications for how these hotspots form in electrodes, and that can also give rise to many catastrophic failure mechanisms. So this is work we've just published a few weeks ago, and you can see here with larger particle sizes, again, stress gets built up. This is another example of taking a thin film, and after a couple of cycles, you see the fracture happen and cracks propagate through the motif. So what we've done here is we've done this is work by Yuting Luo in my group, and what Yuting has done is she's done in situ X-ray diffraction across the charging discharging of a cell that contains B2O5, and she sees a large amount of irreversibility at the end at the end of the charge phase, because you never fully go back, and there's always a lot of phase mixtures present, because as you kind of step through these intercalation induced phase transformations, you end up having multiple phases stabilized, and all of these are present at the end. And that's sort of why the fact that these different phases form and they have different lattice constants gives rise to stress inside the electrode structure that accumulates. And what's worse is it keeps getting worse with each cycle, right? So the extent of heterogeneity keeps getting worse in each cycle. She also, did some measurements using energy dispersive X-ray diffraction, taking slices of X-ray diffraction along a full cell. And again, we see that in the bulk V2O5 large particles, you see a lot of heterogeneity. And because you get a lot of heterogeneity, that also correlates with a lot of stress. The stress distribution is shown on the right, and the heterogeneity is shown on the left. You end up seeing a lot of stress getting built up in the system. Okay, so these are all the problems, and we spent a lot of time looking at the problems. So small polarons are forming and are essentially a means of stress in current concentrators. We see things like charge striping along nanowires as a result of phase segregation. You see coupled ionic electronic barriers, and the lithium-ion diffusion phase evolution is strongly dependent on particle geometry. And because of these lithiation heterogeneities, phase heterogeneities, you end up getting a lot of stress getting built up, and that affects both the durability of the electrode as well as the charge and discharge rates that are possible. So how long it takes for you to charge and discharge these also become affected by this. So how do we solve this problem? So, okay, so this is a lot of work admiring the problem. So I'm going to talk about two general strategies. One approach has to do with mesoscale phenomena, so using the same material, and the other approach has to do with really going back to the basics and coming up with entirely new compounds. Okay, so I'll try to go through both. So one thing we quickly found is that bending a wire using curvature allows us to really carefully control these lithium rich and lithium poor domains and establish regions of low and high stress. And bending wires in the right way so that they can dissipate stress is much better than having them break in a bad way, right? This is an example of cohesive delamination where the wire is breaking instead of bending, right? So bending good, it allows you to survive instead of breaking bad. Okay. Another idea that we were able to use that's more geometric, and this paper is now published in Matter. We were able to make these inverse opal structures through templating, and by templating the structures, this is what these look like. You can see that if I have an individual particle, there's a hot spot. If there's an individual curved particle, there's a hot spot and a cold spot here, right? So high lithiation, low lithiation. But if I have continuous curvature, we end up getting very homogeneous lithiation. So continuous curvature allows for increased diffusion rates as well as increased homogeneity. So incorporating curvature is a means of getting high rate lithiation without sacrificing stability, and you don't get this elastic misfit strain in this system. So this is a pictorial depiction of this. Is that by going through continuous lithiation, we can lithiate a whole lot more, and you also end up not having these large stresses built up. This is a stress map again. So again, here you've got hot spots and low spots, and you considerably mitigate the stresses in these three inverse opal structures because the structure is able to breathe, right? It is able to expand in and out of the plane in the z direction. It's got negative curvature. It's able to expand in and out into the empty room. So curvature is a really good way to mitigate strain evolution and to improve lifetimes. And sure enough, we've done this. We've taken patterned electrodes and we've made batteries out of these, cells out of these, and they perform much better with respect to capacity retention as compared to unpatterned films. So so we're over 94% retention of discharge capacity after 100 cycles. So this is a really fun solution, but it doesn't fully solve the problem because there's a lot of empty space. So the volumetric energy density of such structures is very low. So going back to what you could do in a real battery, again, this is work we just published, and what we can do is we can go to very small particle sizes, okay? So below 35 nanometers or so. And when we go to these small particle sizes, you can no longer stabilize phase boundaries in the system. And since you can no longer stabilize phase boundaries, you end up having single phase lithiation the entire way through, and you in fact stabilize a metastable form of lithium V2O5, and then you can take it out again and you can sort of cycle it, and it's completely reversible. So really by going to smaller dimensions, you fundamentally change the intercalation phase diagram. So a bulk electrode goes through this series of transformations, which eventually become irreversible. In a nanostructured electrode, you instead take a different path. You stabilize this highly lithiated epsilon prime structure instead of stabilizing phase boundaries, and then you can sort of go ahead and stabilize the more lithiated structure. So this allows, so particle geometry essentially allows us to have a much smoother or a much more homogeneous progression of intercalation in these transformations without these large phase boundaries that cause mechanical damage. And so the critical size, at least for this system, is about 40 nanometers or so. And again, you can see this here, the difference between large particles on the top and small particles, very pronounced distribution of lithium concentrations, which then also correlates with much more homogeneous lithiation and much less stress buildup in the system. So you get much more longer lasting batteries that where you mitigate this electrochemistry mechanics coupling. So going back, so geometric effects are fun. What could we do that is sort of more chemical? So V2O5, this takes us into the realm of metastable structures. So essentially for any given composition, right, you have a thermodynamic minimum, but you also have many metastable states. So the example that I think is most familiar is for carbon. You have graphite as the thermodynamic minimum, but then you've got diamond and buckyballs and carbon nanotubes as being metastable states. So how do you stabilize a metastable state in a way that you can do, you can find interesting new motifs while still taking advantage of this multi-redox character of vanadium and the high theoretical capacity of vanadium, right? So can we find entirely modified structures of vanadium V2O5 that mitigate the challenges of this structure that I talked about? So how do we navigate these rugged energy landscapes to find new polymorphs that have entirely different pathways for ion diffusion? So they're still all V2O5, but the structure is different. Okay, so let's start with this. And so we call it alpha V2O5. This is what I've been talking about so far the entire time. This is the three-dimensional structure. So can we use topochemistry to access different states? So we go through this motif, and like I said, beyond gamma, we stabilize this gamma prime. The irreversible phase transformation. If we pull the lithium ions out, we get this structure of V2O5 that is very different from the original alpha V2O5 structure, strongly puckered, but still exactly V2O5 in composition, right? So so composition and structure are not, we've been able to delink that. And we can go through and we can stabilize these beta prime phases when the ion in a ternary by inserting silver or copper ions, and then we can take the silver and copper ions, etch it out, and stabilize this zeta phase, which is a 1D tunnel structured phase. Okay, and so on and so forth. This is for more copper, we can stabilize a lambda phase. So there's a whole host of metastable compounds that are accessible for us to do chemistry. And so that allows us to solve some of the problems of alpha V2O5 at a fundamental atomistic electronic structure level. So another way to, this is a graphic by Abhishek. Alpha V2O5, if you could imagine puckering it, that's the relation with gamma prime V2O5. If you condense two layers, alternate layers, that becomes this rho prime phase. If you then shift the stacking sequence, that becomes the delta prime phase. So we've got many, many different structures that are formally V2O5, but have very different geometries, very different bonding, very different atomic connectivity. So this is a energy landscape. So one thing that we've gotten interested in, and this is going to be the last thing I'll talk about, is, to really know what's going on, you need single crystals, right? So for protein, those of you that worked with biological systems, having a protein crystal structure really was game changing in terms of designing molecules that can bind in specific sites and so on and so forth, and for really doing atomistic level design, right? For doing docking. So the challenge, of course, is it's just been impossible for most of these battery cathodes to obtain single crystals and then to follow using atomic resolution these ion diffusion pathways, right? So gamma prime V2O5 is a very well characterized polymorph, but only known from powder XRD. So same goes for these structures. So here's a compound, zeta V2O5, that we've been able to grow as single crystals, right? So we have a metastable phase available as a single crystal, and then we can lithiate this structure, the entire structure of zeta V2O5. We can lithiate it, and we can watch the essentially ions moving through in real time, because we're taking single crystal structures of lattices that have been topochemically lithiated after synthesis. So the lithium ions are in the process of moving through the entire big hunk of crystal. And by looking at it, we can now access single crystals at each point in the discharge profile of zeta V2O5 and figure out with high resolution crystal structures where exactly the ions lie. And so therefore we can map out the entire pathway, the atomic pathway that ions have through the lattice. And that's what we've done. That's what Joseph has done here, where you can see how ions diffuse through this lattice. Okay, and from C to Q to beta, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and this allows us to, once you know exactly what the pathway looks like, you can modify it. This is a little bit of a commercial cathode that we've now built out of this. Lasts for 600 cycles, does very well. This is a former student, Brian Schultz, his company's Dimian, that is pushing this cathode forward. So it just gives you an example of a story where, through doing a lot of basic science, we've designed a new cathode that is moving towards commercialization. So why is this zeta structure so much better than alpha? Now that we have single crystal structures, we can start to answer some questions there. So remember, this was 8 to 3 to 8. This zeta here is 4, 3, 5, 3, 4. So much smaller bond breaking and bond formation. So the changes in local coordination environment are not as drastic in here. And so that gives us the chance to really, the diffusion barriers are much smaller. Another thing, talking about electronic conductivity, we saw all of the problems that result from this dxy state in alpha V2O5, which gives rise to a polaron, and so on and so forth. Here we've got these in zeta V2O5, lots of degenerate 3D states, and so the electrons are not as strongly localized. And so this allows, again, much easier electronic conductivity and easier polaron diffusion through the lattice. And so when we do this, go back and do this in situ operando measurements, we see complete recovery of the structure. And the only thing that happens, unlike the large changes in phase transformations in alpha V2O5, the only thing that happens is that there's a reordering of ions in the tunnels of zeta V2O5. And so we can do this for other structures as well. This is not just for zeta. My time is almost done, so I'm gonna stop with showing you a crystal structure that we've just recently solved. And Joseph Handy, who solved the crystal structure, is also a musician, and so he's composed his own little music to go with this. So this is an example of directly lithium eye view of tracing out the entire path that that lithium takes through the structure. So I'm going to stop here and be happy to take any questions. So really, I think what is a lot of fun for this is if you ever played the game Jenga, right? This is what we're doing here at the chemical level. And we're taking out some bricks and inserting new bricks and designing new cathode architectures in this way. So we'll stop here and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Banerjee. And this was really nice to see ACS Science Talk getting musical in one sense. So thank you so much. And again, before moving into the Q&A section, we'll take a quick poll for the audience, and I'll post the poll for the audience here. So here we go. And the questions that we have for the audience is, after attending the ACS Science Talks, how likely are you to recommend ACS Science Talk to a colleague, publish in an ACS journal, join or renew membership with ACS? Are you attending ACS Science Talks for the first time? Yes or no? How did you hear about ACS Science Talks you are attending? Any mode of communication like WhatsApp, website, emailers from your friend, colleagues? And I'll wait for a couple of seconds. And I can see the responses coming in. So I'll start the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll end the poll. And yeah, here we have the results for all of us. And it's great to see that 68% of the people would like to share about ACS Science Talk to their colleague. And good to see that 36% of the people are joining ACS Science Talk for the first time. And again, emailers are the best mode of communication. Thank you so much for sharing your responses.